Welcome, weary wanderers of the internet, and prepare to be whisked away on a fantastical journey through the annals of history. I'm your humble narrator, here to guide you through tales so mind-boggling, so outrageously true, they'll have you snoring in no time. Forget counting sheep. Tonight, we're counting kings, specifically the ones who went a little or a lot bonkers. So, snuggle into your comfiest nooks, adjust your imaginary crowns, and let's delve into the hilariously tragic lives of medieval monarchs, whose reigns were less happily ever after, and more, oops, I dropped my scepter and my sanity. Before we embark on this historical slumber party, feel free to drop a comment below. Let me know where in the world you're currently attempting to defy the laws of wakefulness, and what peculiar time of day it is for you. And if you find yourself delightfully dozing off to the sound of my soothing tones and these utterly unbelievable historical anecdotes, be a dear and subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss our future expeditions into the quirky corners of the past. Now, would you? Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtains on some of medieval history's most spectacularly unhinged rulers. These aren't your average run-of-the-mill monarchs. Oh no, these are the kings whose eccentricities were so grand, their decisions so baffling. They make your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving dinner look like a beacon of normalcy. Through their stories, we'll ponder the peculiar pressures of power, the surprising symptoms of royal neuroses, and the lasting impressions these regal oddballs left on their kingdoms, and, frankly, on our collective sense of what on earth were they thinking. So, get ready to giggle into your pillow, perhaps even snort a little at the sheer absurdity, and let me transport you back in time to the drafty castles and surprisingly scandalous courts of medieval Europe. Our first stop on this royal roller coaster of mental mishaps takes us to 14th century France, a land renowned for its fine wines, philosophical debates, and, in this case, a king who thought he was made of glass. Yes, you heard that right. Glass. Charles VI of France, the king who thought he was a fragile teacup, and a wolf, and St. George. Imagine, if you will, the year 1380. France is buzzing with optimism. A new king, Charles VI, has ascended to the throne at the tender age of 11. He's young, he's energetic, he's got a charming smile that could melt even the most hardened knight's armour. His subjects absolutely adored him, showering him with the rather affectionate nickname, Charles the Beloved. He was known for his chivalry, his charisma, and throwing parties so grand, they'd make modern-day Coachella look like a backyard BBQ. The future of France, my friends, seemed brighter than a newly polished suit of armour. Innocence. It's so fleeting, especially when you're a medieval monarch. Our tale takes a rather flammable turn on a fateful winter night in 1393. The king, being the life of the party, was attending a masquerade ball at the royal palace. Now, this wasn't your average fancy dress party. Oh no. The men, including our soon-to-be shattered monarch, were dressed as wild men. Think medieval Bigfoot, but with a highly flammable twist. Their costumes were made of linen, soaked in resinous wax or pitch, to which flax was attached to give them that authentic savage look. What could possibly go wrong, you ask? Well, this is a medieval story, so pretty much everything. As the dancing reached its fever pitch, a moment of pure, unadulterated medieval idiocy struck. The king's brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, in a move that can only be described as not thinking, brought a torch way too close to the dancers. You can practically hear the collective gasp of historians everywhere. Poof! The highly flammable costumes ignited instantly, turning the wild men into human torches. Chaos, screams, and the distinct smell of burning flax filled the hall. It was less a masquerade and more a massacre. In a moment of quick thinking that probably saved France a whole lot of paperwork, the Duchess of Berry, bless her quick-witted soul, hurled her magnificent robe over the king, extinguishing the flames and saving his life. 4 other noblemen, however, weren't so lucky. They were badly burned and, in a truly agonizing fashion, died days later. This incident, forever etched in history as the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men, left Charles physically unscathed. Mentally, well, that's where our story truly begins to descend into glorious madness. In the months that followed, Charles began to exhibit signs of mental distress that would make a modern-day psychiatrist reach for their largest notepad. Whispers circulated through the court like wildfire. The king has gone mad from the shock. And indeed, his behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. At times, he would tear through the palace corridors, howling like a wolf, convinced he was a creature of the wild. But that wasn't even the most perplexing of his delusions. Our dear Charles became utterly convinced he was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. Imagine the royal physicians trying to treat a man who believed a strong breeze could turn him into a pile of expensive shards. They probably prescribed a lot of bubble wrap. He'd often forget his name, his title, and even fail to recognize his own wife and children. One time, he became so utterly convinced he was St. George that he had the royal arms changed to reflect his newfound sainthood. I'm sure the royal heralds had a field day with that one. For months on end, he refused to bathe, change his clothes, or even cut his hair or nails. Courtiers, with a mixture of pity and revulsion, described him as wandering about in tattered, vermin-infested robes, his hair matted and filthy. Imagine the smell. You thought your teenager's room was bad. Now, it wasn't all howling and glass-like fragility. In his lucid moments, Charles was described as gentle and melancholy. Deeply distressed by his own condition, he'd catch glimpses of his reality, and the sheer tragedy of his situation would weigh heavily on him. But these periods of clarity grew rarer, like finding a reliable Wi-Fi signal in a medieval castle. As Charles plunged deeper into the murky waters of madness, France, predictably, began to crumble around him. With the king incapacitated, rival factions of nobles and ambitious relatives pounced on the opportunity to advance their own agendas, maneuvering to control the crown. It was a royal free-for-all. The king's periods of insanity created a power vacuum so enormous you could fit a small army into it, and it destabilized the entire kingdom. The decades of Charles's reign were marked by increasing turmoil, both at home and abroad. Ambitious nobles and relatives of the king vied for power and influence, their infighting fracturing the country into 1,000 squabbling pieces. Meanwhile, across the Channel, England, ever the opportunist, seized on France's weakness to press its claims to the French throne. Cue the dramatic music, because the 100 Years' War was about to get a whole lot more 100-year sea. Through it all, Charles drifted in and out of lucidity, a king in name, but certainly not in faculty. When sensible, he tried to fulfill his royal duties and bring some semblance of stability to his fractured kingdom. But these moments were briefer and rarer than a unicorn sighting. More often than not, he spent his days in a pitiful state, unable to rule, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of his own royal discombobulation. There are poignant stories of the mad king's gentler moments. During a brief respite from his illness, Charles encountered one of his old friends, a knight he hadn't seen in years. Prized to see him at court, Charles, with a flicker of his old self, asked why he had come. With tears in his eyes, the old knight replied, to see you, my king, for it has been long since I last did." Charles, in a rare moment of profound clarity, embraced him with affection and wept, saying, "Good sir, you are indeed one of my loyal knights and friends. Stay with me, for you are most welcome." For just a moment, the king had surfaced from the depths of his madness, lucid and touched by this display of love and loyalty. But such moments were fleeting, like a particularly pleasant dream before the alarm goes off. As the years trudged on, Charles grew more withdrawn and isolated, lost in the labyrinth of his own failing mind. By the end of his life, he was a mere shell of the vibrant young man who had once been the promising hope of France. When he finally succumbed to a bout of dysentery in 1422, his son, Charles VII, had already begun to rule in his stead. The reign of Charles VI, which began with such hope and promise, ended in sorrow and disarray. The king whom the people had once loved so ardently spent his final years a broken man, sometimes pitiful, sometimes terrifying in the grip of his delusions. His sad fate demonstrates how much the fortunes of a nation could turn on the stability of a ruler's mind, in an age where kings wielded absolute but often fragile power. Moonru Natchathirangal. Henry VI of England, the king who preferred books to battles, and also forgot he was king. From one troubled king, we now journey across the Channel to England, a land of perpetually damp weather, questionable culinary choices, and another monarch whose reign was marred by mental illness. Like Charles, Henry VI was gentle, pious, and scholarly in nature, but also, like his French counterpart, he would find the pressures of kingship far too much to bear, with devastating consequences for his realm. It's almost as if being king in the Middle Ages was a guaranteed ticket to a nervous breakdown. Henry's reign was troubled from the start, for he inherited the throne as an infant. He was far too young to rule in his own right, unless the kingdom was run by a council of particularly intelligent teddy bears. Regents ruled in his name, while rival factions plotted to control the child king, hoping to dominate the kingdom through him. It was less Game of Thrones and more Game of Nappies, but with much higher stakes. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by a ferocious struggle for power between the king's ambitious relatives and advisors, all vying for their piece of the royal pie. Even as a youth, Henry was more inclined towards religion and learning than the arts of war and statecraft, which, let's face it, were pretty essential for a medieval king. Deeply devout, he took pleasure in daily attendance at Mass, and devoted many hours to prayer and contemplation. He was also a keen scholar with a love of reading and an interest in education. In fact, Henry would go on to found two of England's most venerable institutions of learning, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. So, he might have been a bit of a dud as a warrior king, but he was a smashing success as a patron of academia. Perhaps he should have just opened a really big library instead of ruling a kingdom. But while Henry's gentle nature earned him affection, it left him ill-equipped for the power struggles and political machinations that swirled around the throne. As he came of age and assumed his full royal duties, he floundered in his attempts to control the squabbling factions and bring unity to his kingdom. He was less a king and more a very polite doormat for the ambitious nobles. The greatest blow to Henry's reign came in August 1453, when the king suddenly fell into an inert stupor, a state of catatonic bliss. He was unable to speak, recognize anyone, or respond to any stimuli. For more than a year, he remained in this vegetative state, not even reacting to the birth of his own son and heir. Imagine the midwife announcing, "It's a boy," and the king just staring blankly at the ceiling. Not ideal. As with his grandfather, Charles VI of France, whom he resembled in both character and fate. Henry's mysterious illness thrust his kingdom into turmoil. With the king incapacitated, old feuds and rivalries erupted into open conflict. The simmering resentment between the houses of Lancaster and York, two cadet branches of the Plantagenet royal house, now boiled over into outright war. This struggle would become known as the Wars of the Roses, named after the rather lovely red and white rose emblems of Lancaster and York. It was a war fought over who got to sit on the very uncomfortable throne, all while the king was basically on an extended snooze button. Even when Henry briefly emerged from his catatonia in late 1454, he struggled to reassert control over the chaotic political scene. By 1455, the Yorkists felt bold enough to take up arms against the king's Lancastrian supporters, defeating them at the First Battle of St. Albans. Henry was captured by the Yorkists and forced to acknowledge their leader, Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector of the realm. Basically, he went from king to glorified hostage with a fancy title. In the years that followed, England descended into a state of intermittent civil war, with the hapless Henry shunted back and forth between the warring factions, like a very confused royal parcel. Whenever the king lapsed back into one of his periods of insensibility, fresh fighting would break out as each side tried to secure control of his person, and, with it, the legitimacy of rule. It was a never-ending game of whose king is it anyway? During his bouts of madness, Henry's behaviour was pitiful and childlike. He had to be fed, washed, and dressed like an infant. The once keen scholar now took no pleasure in his books and papers. He gave no sign of recognising his own wife and son. To most observers, the king seemed utterly lost within himself, an empty vessel stripped of will and sense. Henry briefly regained his throne with Lancastrian support in 1470, but by this point, he was a king in name only, a feeble puppet controlled by his ambitious queen, Margaret of Anjou, and the ruthless Earl of Warwick. He was less a ruler and more a really expensive prop. Less than a year later, the Yorkists struck back, capturing Henry and forcing him to abdicate in favour of the Yorkist king, Edward IV. The sad final chapter of Henry's life unfolded within the confines of the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned by King Edward. There, abandoned by his allies and bereft of his crown, Henry's already fragile grasp on reality disintegrated completely. When informed of the death of his young son at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he reportedly showed no reaction, lost in the midst of his own shattered mind. Just a few days later, on the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry himself was dead, found lifeless in his chamber, under mysterious circumstances, while the official account claimed he died of pure displeasure and melancholy. Many contemporary observers suspected foul play, with the finger of blame pointed squarely at the Yorkist king. After all, dead kings are much less problematic than living ones, especially if they keep zoning out. And so ended the tragic life of Henry VI, a king perhaps too gentle and good for the ruthless times into which he was born. His decades of misrule, punctuated by devastating bouts of mental illness, fractured the royal dynasty and plunged England into one of its darkest chapters. Like Charles the Mad across the Channel, Henry's sad fate demonstrates the immense impact that a monarch's mental state could have on the fortunes of an entire nation. It's almost as if stability is a good thing for a country. Who knew? Mundre Nachatrangal. Eric XIV of Sweden, the king who suspected everyone, especially that sneaky squirrel. From England, we now travel north to Scandinavia, a land of Vikings, meatballs, and, in our next tale, a 16th century ruler, whose promising reign was derailed by paranoia and madness. Eric XIV of Sweden had all the makings of a strong monarch. He was well educated, cultured, and charismatic. But like Charles and Henry before him, he would succumb to mental illness with disastrous consequences for his kingdom. It seems the good at ruling gene skipped a generation or two in the royal families of Europe. Eric ascended to the Swedish throne in 1560 after the death of his formidable father, Gustav I. He inherited a strong, centralized state and initially proved himself a capable ruler. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, an accomplished scholar, poet, and composer. Basically, the kind of guy you'd want to invite to your Renaissance fair if he wasn't, about to go utterly mad. But even amid the festivities of his splendid coronation, there were hints of the erratic behavior and delusions that would later consume him. His insistence on riding a white stallion, a privilege traditionally reserved for the day of Christ's second coming, raised eyebrows. And the lavish, almost bacchanalian festivities, featuring 3 days and nights of non-stop feasting, drinking, and dancing, seemed to some to border on sacrilege. Clearly, Eric liked a good party, perhaps a little too much. As his reign progressed, Eric grew increasingly suspicious and paranoid. Seeing threats and conspiracies all around him, he became convinced that his own nobles and the aristocracy of neighbouring Denmark and Poland were plotting to overthrow him and steal his crown. These fears were fanned by his chief advisor, Göran Persson, who, like a medieval Iago, exploited the king's fragile mental state to eliminate his own political enemies. Imagine a court where the king suspects the teacups are whispering about him, and his advisor just eggs him on. Eric's personal life was equally tumultuous. Early in his reign, he fell passionately in love with Karin Mansdotter, a beautiful commoner who had been a maid in the royal household, against all convention and the admonitions of his advisors, who were probably screaming, "Think of the bloodline, your majesty." Eric secretly married Karin in 1567 and had her crowned as queen, while the marriage caused a scandal that echoed across Europe. Karin would prove a stabilizing influence, remaining loyal to Eric even during his darkest days. She was the one person who could talk him down from believing his own shadow was plotting against him. The defining moment of Eric's reign came in 1567 with the infamous Sture murders. Convinced that the Sture noble family and their allies were plotting against him, Eric had several members of the family imprisoned and brought to trial on trumped-up charges. In a fit of rage and paranoia, the king himself stabbed and killed one of the nobles, Niels Sture, during an interrogation. 2 other Sture lords and several of their associates were subsequently executed on Eric's orders. The Sture murders shocked the nation and turned sentiment against the increasingly unstable king. Suddenly, the wild man costumes from the Ball of the Burning Men didn't seem so bad. Eric's behavior grew more erratic and delusional. He became obsessed with astrology and the occult. Convinced he could read the future in the stars, he would have bouts of wild, manic energy, alternating with periods of deep melancholy. At times, he fancied himself a god, demanding his courtiers worship him. Can you imagine that awkwardness? All hail King Eric. Also, can I get a glass of water, please, your divinity? As opposition to Eric's rule mounted, his own brothers, John and Charles, seized the opportunity to move against him. In 1568, they successfully deposed Eric, forcing him to abdicate in favour of John III. The coup was supported by most of the Swedish nobility, alienated by the king's tyranny and madness. Turns out, nobody likes a king who stabs his own nobles and thinks he's a deity. Eric's final years were marked by tragedy and increasing mental deterioration. Imprisoned in a succession of castles by his brother, the deposed king descended deeper into insanity. He became convinced he was not Eric XIV at all, but a different man altogether. His devoted wife, Karin, remained with him in captivity, the only person who could soothe him in his agitated states. In 1577, after almost a decade in confinement, the 43-year-old Eric died, likely poisoned on the orders of his brother. He was buried hastily and without ceremony, for John III, the mad brother, represented an uncomfortable reminder of the fragility of royal power and the ever-present danger of succession crisis. Eric XIV's story represents a tragic waste of potential. He was a gifted man, educated and cultured, who held such promise as a ruler, but like many monarchs, he found himself unequal to the immense stresses and paranoias of kingship. His unraveling mind led him down a path of tyranny and terror that undid his achievements and ruptured the kingdom. It's almost as if being king requires a certain level of groundedness, not a belief that the constellations are plotting against you. Mundru Nakshatrangal. Ivan IV Vasilievich, the Terrible of Russia, the Tsar who loved torture and chess, sometimes simultaneously. Travelling further east to Russia, we come to the dark tale of another ruler, undone by paranoia and crippling mental illness. Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was the first Grand Prince of Moscow to officially assume the title of Tsar of all Russia. His nearly 40-year reign would transform Russia, but also unleash a whirlwind of madness and brutality upon his realm. Think of him as the original bad boy of Russian history, only with more impalings. Ivan's early life was scarred by tragedy, struggle, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. He lost both his parents by the age of 8 and grew up in the shadow of ambitious nobles and relatives who fought to control the regency. The young Ivan learned to fear for his life and saw enemies and conspiracies everywhere, even in the shadows of the Kremlin walls. These early experiences undoubtedly laid the groundwork for the paranoia and ruthlessness that would define his later reign. Imagine being a child, constantly worried someone's going to poison your porridge or rearrange your toy knights into a rebellious formation. When Ivan reached adulthood and took full power in 1547, he quickly set about consolidating control over the fractious boyar nobility. Talented and energetic, he scored a series of impressive military victories over Russia's enemies, expanding the boundaries of his state. He launched a series of popular reforms, revising the legal code and convoking Russia's first parliament. Thanks to these successes, the early part of Ivan's reign was marked by relative stability and progress. He was the Tsar who had it all: power, conquests, and a seemingly stable mind. But, as we've learned, sanity is a fleeting thing in the world of medieval monarchs. As the years passed, Ivan grew increasingly erratic, suspicious, and violent. He became convinced that the boyars were plotting against him, determined to thwart his agenda and usurp his power. His simmering resentment boiled over in 1565, when he abruptly left Moscow in a fit of rage, threatening to abdicate. In a clever power play, Ivan agreed to return only if he was granted absolute authority to punish traitors and enemies of the state as he saw fit. Cowed, the boyars agreed. Big mistake, boyars. Huge. Upon his return, Ivan set about terrorizing the nobility, confiscating their lands and executing or exiling those he mistrusted. To enforce his will, he created the oprichniki, a brutal corps of secret police fanatically loyal to him alone. Clad all in black and riding black horses, the oprichniki became a terrifying symbol of the Tsar's unbridled power. They were essentially the medieval equivalent of a heavily armed, psychopathic biker gang, only with official royal sanction. In the following years, Ivan earned his moniker of the Terrible as he unleashed a reign of terror upon Russia, fueled by paranoia and sadistic impulse. He inflicted cruel punishments on anyone he suspected of treachery. Torture, public executions, and mass killings became commonplace. He even destroyed entire noble families, towns, and even the city of Novgorod to root out alleged conspiracies against him. Imagine the conversations. "What's for dinner, dear?" "Oh, just another public execution, I think." The later period of Ivan's reign also saw a tragic upheaval in his personal life that would push him further into madness and savagery. In 1581, during a heated argument, Ivan struck his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. Enraged, his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, engaged in a fierce shouting match with his father. In a fit of uncontrolled rage, Ivan the Terrible struck his son in the head with his iron-tipped staff, dealing a fatal blow. Mad with grief and remorse, Ivan descended into an incoherent rampage, alternatively praying feverishly for forgiveness and ordering fresh executions. The loss of his son and heir represented not just a personal tragedy, but a dynastic disaster for Russia. His remaining sons were unfit to rule, the middle son an invalid from birth, the youngest a man described as depraved. The future of Russia looked as grim as a winter's day in Siberia. It's a poignant and haunting scene to imagine the mighty Tsar, his hands stained with the blood of his own son, weeping over the lifeless body of his heir. In that moment, one can almost see the weight of all Ivan's cruelties and paranoia coming crashing down upon him. The realization of the monster he had become. The death of his son seemed to break something in Ivan. In his final years, he retreated increasingly into himself, spending long hours in prayer and contemplation. But even as his physical health declined, his mental state remained as sharp and paranoid as ever. He continued to lash out at those around him, seeing betrayal in every shadow. Ivan the Terrible died in 1584 while engaged in a game of chess. According to legend, he had just moved his king to the square where it would be checkmated, as if acknowledging the inevitability of his own demise. It was a fitting end for a man whose life had been defined by a ruthless struggle for power. Ivan's legacy is a complex and bloody one. He was a man of contradictions, capable of great cruelty and great piety, of brutal violence and deep remorse. He expanded Russia's borders and centralized its government, but at a terrible cost in human suffering. He was feared by his enemies and revered by his subjects, a towering figure who cast a long and dark shadow over Russian history. As we reflect on Ivan's story, it's hard not to be struck by the tragedy of it all. Here was a man who had every advantage: power, wealth, intelligence, but who was ultimately undone by his own paranoia and cruelty. His life is a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of unchecked power and the terrible toll that fear and suspicion can take on the human soul. But perhaps there is a lesson to be found in Ivan's story as well. For all his flaws and failings, Ivan was a man who grappled with the weight of his own conscience. In his final years, he seems to have recognized the enormity of his sins and sought some measure of redemption through prayer and repentance. It is a reminder that even the most terrible of us may still have some spark of humanity buried deep within, and it is a call to remember that power, for all its seductions, is ultimately a heavy burden to bear, one that can crush the soul if not tempered with wisdom, compassion, and humility. So let us remember Ivan the Terrible not just as a tyrant or a madman, but as a deeply flawed and complex human being, one whose story still has much to teach us about the perils and responsibilities of power. Mundre Nachitrangal, the unfortunate reign of Alfonso, 10 of Castile, the wise king who was bad at being king. Now, Let's journey to the sun-drenched lands of medieval Spain, to the Kingdom of Castile, where we meet a king who was definitely not terrible in the traditional sense, but whose wisdom somehow managed to make his reign an absolute disaster. Gather round, sleepy heads, for the tale of Alfonso X, also known as Alfonso the Wise, a man so brilliant he was practically a medieval Google, but so utterly hopeless at actual governance, it's almost comical. Alfonso X, born in 1221, was a Renaissance man before the Renaissance even knew what it was. He was a scholar, a poet, an astronomer, a legal reformer, and even a composer of beautiful music. He funded massive translation projects, bringing the wisdom of Arabic and Greek texts to Latin Europe. He even published the Cantigas de Santa Maria, a collection of over 400 poems set to music, mostly about the miracles of the Virgin Mary. He was basically the medieval equivalent of a rock star professor. You could ask him about the movement of the planets, the intricacies of law, or how to compose a catchy tune, and he'd have an answer. Ask him how to balance a budget or win a war, and he'd probably just stare blankly or start quoting poetry. His reign began in 1252, and for a while, things seemed promising. He reformed the legal system, attempting to create a unified code of law for his kingdom, which was a pretty revolutionary idea at the time. He even tried to claim the Holy Roman Empire for himself, a rather ambitious undertaking that drained his treasury and made him about as popular as a tax collector at a jousting tournament. He spent a fortune trying to bribe German princes, only to be constantly outmaneuvered. It was like watching a genius try to play poker for the first time. All the theory, none of the street smarts. Alfonso's problem wasn't malice or madness in the traditional sense. It was a profound disconnect between his intellectual brilliance and the brutal realities of medieval kingship. He was so focused on grand, intellectual pursuits that he seemed to forget the day-to-day grind of ruling. While he was busy translating ancient texts, his nobles were busy plotting against him. His treasury was emptying faster than a sieve, and his kingdom was teetering on the brink of civil war. His tax policies were so disastrous that he managed to alienate almost everyone. He minted debased currency, leading to rampant inflation and economic chaos. Imagine going to the market with a sack of coins, only to find out they're worth less than dirt. Peasants revolted, nobles grumbled, and even his own family started looking at him sideways. And then there was his obsession with astronomy. While his astronomical tables were groundbreaking for their time, Alfonso spent vast sums of money and countless hours staring at the stars, convinced he could predict the future. He famously quipped, "If I had been present at the creation, I should have advised some improvements to the universe," a bold statement, given that his own kingdom was rapidly descending into chaos. Perhaps he should have spent less time designing a better cosmos, and more time designing a better budget. His children, seeing their father's ineptitude and the kingdom's spiraling decline, eventually decided enough was enough. His own son, Sancho IV, led a full-blown rebellion against him. Imagine being deposed by your own offspring because you were too busy writing poems and calculating planetary orbits. Alfonso, in a fit of bitterness, cursed his son and his descendants, ensuring a few generations of bad luck for the Castilian throne. The civil war raged, and Alfonso, the wise king, found himself cornered and defeated. He died in 1284, a bitter and largely discredited monarch. His legacy is a strange paradox. A brilliant intellectual who left behind a treasure trove of knowledge and cultural achievements, but a complete failure as a king. He proved that being smart and cultured doesn't necessarily make you good at actual ruling. Sometimes a king needs less philosophy and more practical elbow grease. So, as you drift off, ponder the curious case of Alfonso X, the king who was too wise for his own good, a man whose brilliance ultimately led to his downfall. Perhaps it's a gentle reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best, and that even the most intelligent minds can be utterly clueless about the real world. The king who loved his dogs more than his kingdom, Philip II of Spain, and the case of the royal canines. Let's cross the Pyrenees once more and jump forward a few centuries to the grand, yet curiously austere, court of Philip II of Spain. Now, Philip wasn't mad in the howling at the moon sense, but his reign was certainly marked by a peculiar obsession that, at times, seemed to overshadow matters of state. His dogs. Yes, you heard that right. While the Spanish Empire was at its zenith, Philip was more concerned with the comfort and well-being of his furry companions than, arguably, the well-being of his human subjects. Philip II, born in 1527, was a meticulous and devout ruler. He built the vast Escorial, a monastery, palace, and mausoleum all rolled into one, a stark testament to his devoutness and his love of monumental architecture. He was the most powerful man in the world, ruling an empire that stretched across continents, from the Americas to the Philippines. Yet, his private life held a charming, if slightly bizarre, quirk. His profound love for his dogs. Philip's royal kennels were not just an afterthought. They were a meticulously managed wing of his court. He employed dedicated staff to care for his hounds, ensuring they received the finest food, medical attention, and even comfortable sleeping arrangements. These weren't just hunting dogs. They were companions, confidants, and, at times, perhaps even more important than his human advisors. There are numerous anecdotes that highlight this peculiar affection. It's said that Philip would personally supervise the feeding of his favourite greyhounds, ensuring they had enough meat and not too much bone. He would spend hours in their company, walking them in the palace gardens, whispering secrets to them, and generally treating them with a level of tenderness he rarely displayed towards his human family. Imagine a critical state meeting. Diplomats from across Europe are squabbling over treaties. The treasury is running low, and the Dutch revolt is flaring up. And there's Philip, meticulously inspecting a new bed for his beloved spaniel, making sure the straw is just so. You can almost hear the sighs of his exasperated ministers. One famous story recounts how, during a particularly intense period of governance, Philip received urgent dispatches from his viceroys in the Americas, detailing a rebellion and a potential loss of valuable silver mines. His response: he reportedly set them aside to attend to a minor ailment suffered by one of his prize-hunting dogs. "The empire can wait," he might have mused, but Fido's tummy ache cannot. While his devotion to his dogs might seem endearing to us modern pet lovers, it was, at times, a distraction from the immense responsibilities of his sprawling empire. His human subjects, meanwhile, were facing crushing taxes, religious persecution, and continuous warfare. One can imagine a peasant, barely eking out a living, hearing tales of the king's pampered pups, and wondering if his dog had a better life than he did. Philip's intense focus on detail, which made him an effective administrator in many ways, also meant he could get bogged down in minutiae, sometimes at the expense of the bigger picture. His canine companions provided a much-needed emotional outlet, a refuge from the immense pressures of his rule. But in the grand scheme of things, a king's affection for his dogs probably shouldn't outweigh the pressing needs of his kingdom. So, as you slowly drift into slumber, picture the great Philip II, ruler of an empire, not poring over maps of distant lands, but gently stroking a furry head, murmuring sweet nothings to his canine friend. It's a reminder that even the most powerful rulers can have their peculiar priorities, and sometimes the most unexpected obsessions can reveal the true character of a king. And perhaps it's a comforting thought. Even the most terrifying leaders can find solace in the simple, unconditional love of a pet. Moondru Natchatrangal. The king who was obsessed with clocks and lost his crown. Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. Our final stop on this historical journey into royal oddities takes us to Prague in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, to the eccentric court of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. Now, Rudolph wasn't mad in the traditional sense, but he was so utterly absorbed in his bizarre hobbies and scientific pursuits that he effectively neglected his immense duties, leading to the gradual disintegration of his vast empire. Prepare yourself for the tale of a king who preferred winding intricate clocks to actually governing. Rudolph II, born in 1552, was a Habsburg, destined for a life of immense power and responsibility. He inherited a sprawling empire that included Bohemia, Hungary, and parts of Germany. But Rudolph was no typical monarch. He was less interested in warfare and politics, and far more fascinated by alchemy, astrology, art, and above all, the intricate mechanisms of clocks. His court in Prague became a magnet for astronomers, alchemists, and artisans from across Europe. Johannes Kepler, the great astronomer, was his court mathematician. Tycho Brahe, the eccentric Danish astronomer with a prosthetic nose, found refuge and patronage there. Rudolph was genuinely curious about the universe, a patron of scientific inquiry. But his inquiries often veered into the esoteric and the outright bizarre. He was obsessed with finding the philosopher's stone, the mythical substance that could turn base metals into gold and grant eternal life. He spent vast sums of money on alchemical experiments, filling his palace with bubbling retorts, strange-smelling concoctions, and charlatan alchemists who promised him riches and immortality. While Europe was gripped by religious wars and political upheaval, Rudolph was busy trying to transmute lead into gold. Imagine the size of his impoverished subjects. But his greatest love was for clocks. Not just any clocks, mind you, but elaborate automated devices, often depicting fantastical scenes or complex astronomical movements. He had a vast collection of them, and he would spend hours meticulously winding them, cleaning them, and admiring their intricate workings. He reportedly knew every gear, every spring, every tiny detail of his beloved timepieces. While his empire was slowly ticking towards collapse, Rudolph was content to ensure his mechanical swans moved gracefully, and his miniature figures chimed on cue. His obsession with clocks was almost a metaphor for his reign. He meticulously focused on the internal mechanisms of his own bizarre world, while the external world, his empire, was falling apart. He was a recluse, rarely appearing in public, and even more rarely attending to the serious business of governance. Petitions went unanswered, dispatches piled up, and urgent matters of state were ignored in favor of a new astrological chart or an alchemical experiment. His bizarre habits and reclusive nature led to whispers of mental instability. He was prone to fits of melancholy and occasional paranoia. He distrusted his family, his nobles, and even his own advisors. His lack of interest in governance created a massive power vacuum, and his Habsburg relatives, seeing the empire teetering on the brink, eventually decided to act. In 1608, his own brother, Matthias, led a revolt against him, forcing Rudolph to abdicate his rule over Hungary, Austria, and Moravia. 4 years later, in 1612, he was forced to give up his Bohemian crown and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. He died shortly after, largely isolated and stripped of most of his power, surrounded by his beloved clocks and the remnants of his eccentric collections. Rudolph's reign is a fascinating example of how even a brilliant and cultured ruler can fail spectacularly if they lack the practical skills and the sheer dedication required for governance. He was a visionary in science and art, but a complete disaster as a king. His story is a poignant reminder that while hobbies are wonderful, when you're responsible for an entire empire, perhaps a healthier balance is required. So, as the last echoes of these tales fade into the night, and as you find your eyelids growing heavier than a medieval suit of armor, remember these eccentric monarchs. They remind us that even the most powerful among us can have their quirks, their follies, and their utterly human struggles. And now, my dear night owls, it's time for you to drift off to dreamland, perhaps dreaming of glass kings, dog-loving monarchs, or emperors obsessed with clocks. May your sleep be as deep and peaceful as a forgotten medieval dungeon, and may your dreams be filled with far more coherent stories than those we've heard tonight. Good night, and sleep soundly. The historical archives will be here when you wake.